So I'm here at my friend's house to pick up some worms. Worms? Sounds weird, but my friend knows all about composting with worm bins, and I really wanted to try some composting out. So she helped me build a bin, and it's really cool. But I needed her to take care of it for a little bit when I went out of town. That turned into like at least 6 months later that she still was taking care of my worm bin. So I'm here to pick him up. But apparently there's 4 times as many worms from when I dropped them off. So we're making another bin to split them, and we figured we'd show you how to make a worm bin, feed them, and take care of them. So here we go. Hello, Krissy.
Hello.
What are you doing?
So I'm actually doing 2 things: protecting my security and making the bedding for the worms. So I actually save all of my important paperwork, I shred it, and that actually is what goes into the bedding of the worms. So I'll take all my important documents and actually just shred them. We're actually just splitting a previous worm bin, so we don't have to have too much. But they don't like to be super dry, so all we'll do is soak a little bit of this. So the perfect kind of description to like bedding of any worm bin is just like a squeezed out sponge. So we're just gonna moisten it just a little bit, and then we're gonna let a lot of that water out so it's not too wet. Fluff it up a little bit, and then that's their bedding. Our bedding, but we need our actual second worm bin. So I actually did most of the work before Courtney got here. So we have 2 different things that'll be on this bin. This is the actual bin that holds the worms. It's super simple. All you need is a hammer and then 2 size nails. So we have a really large nail. That's for these holes on the bottom. So right here, this is gonna actually make sure there's not tons of moisture in your actual worm bin. So you just wanna make sure it can drain properly. Also just kind of move it around a little bit just to make sure those holes are actually sizable. And then we have a smaller nail. Basically we wanna make us little tiny holes on the top to help ventilate. I just recommend getting a little cloth, just poking them, and then do the same thing once it is, and just kind of move them around a little bit. You really wanna make sure they can breathe properly. These holes are super tiny. They actually can't get through these. Worms can get through the big ones, but that's okay because they'll actually make their way up if they do end up in this bottom entrapment. So the only second thing you need, other than this bin that you just put your holes in on the bottom and the top, you'll make sure you get 1 lid, and then you just need a second bin without a lid itself. So this one right here won't have any holes at all, doesn't need any aeration, doesn't need definitely drainage, and they'll just stack in. This just makes sure that you don't make a mess. I've never had any sort of spillage, leakage, or any like messes come out of my worm bin. And it's just all self-containing. All right, so this is actually Courtney's bin. She dropped this off 6 months ago. I actually have my very own worm bin that I was taking care of too, but some mishaps happened. I had a small die-off. But this bin has actually already been split once before. So my old bin I actually gifted to a friend, took half of Courtney's worms and filled it, and then it's already filled back to the top. So now I'll actually make the second bin. So we're gonna put a little bit of bedding. They have a lot of bedding still in there, but I wanted to just give them a little bit more fluff. And they'll eat this paper. So you won't see any paper remnants after a few months. It all decomposes and goes into the worms. And then we're also gonna add just a little bit of dry because the bin was a little wet. So anytime you think it's dry, add some dry paper, or if you have the coconut shreds in there as well. So I just wanna mix a little bit because that bin was a little dry. So we're just gonna do a little bit of bedding to mix in with them. So we're literally gonna just transplant half of them into here. So you literally just pick them up. Make sure we get plenty of worms so Courtney has a nice good base. So there's actually already some food in here, but we're gonna feed them as well, just to get her started off real well. And this works out really well because my bin was seriously, Courtney's bin was seriously to the top. So when she hit me up telling me she's back in town and like more able to take care of them, I was like, perfect, because I seriously could not fit any more food into this. So now that we split half and half and we have all the bedding on the bottom, we just want to make sure it's really incorporated in so they have plenty of bedding. And then it's also, my worm bin was a little bit dry, so I want to mix in the actual coconut shreds to make sure that it's kind of a nice consistency. So some things you do want to watch out for. You don't want your worm bin getting too wet. You actually start to smell it. So your worm bin actually smells like earth. It should smell like a fresh walk through a forest. Things that you will want to keep an eye on. If it gets too wet, you'll get a process called anaerobic digestion, which means without air or oxygen. So it means that there's so much moisture in the actual soil itself that oxygen isn't getting to the soil and getting to the worms to help decompose. And it'll actually smell like a methane, like methane is actually what's being off-emitted. So it starts to smell sour. If that's ever the case, just take some dry paper, incorporate that in, or that coconut shreds, and it really helps balance out that moisture. So now that the worm bin's all set, we put some new bedding in there, so they have that to be amongst. They are all set. We are just going to feed them a little bit. So I got some beets, and I ate as many of the greens as I possibly can, but I made tons of them. So anytime I feed them, they don't, like I said earlier, they don't eat the food itself. Bacteria will start to decompose it, and the worms are actually eating the bacteria that grows on your food. So what I like to do, just to make sure things don't like start rotting at a faster rate before they can get to them, I do bury them a little bit. So I'll just lift up a little dirt, I'll put my food in there, and then I'll just cover them.
Where did you get the worm bins?
Yeah, so these boxes actually I just bought at Home Depot.
Perfect.
Yeah. So you do want to make sure the bins are not see-through, so the worms they think they're in the dirt. So you don't want them to actually be clear because it'll mess them up. They don't like the light. They actually run away from when you lift the lid of your worm bin, so you make sure it is not see-through.
Perfect. What foods do my worms love, and what type of food should I avoid?
So worms love banana peels. Like, they absolutely love them. But I think of, when it comes to food to feed them, I think of worms as like sensitive children with sensitive diets. So some things you don't want to feed them is anything acidic. So the citrus, anything grapefruit, oranges, lemons, it's just too acidic for them. And I just think of them having like really bad heartburn. And then I also don't feed mine like garlic or onion because I think that's just a little too strong. But things they love are vegetables, so any greens. I also do throw potatoes in there. I have an avocado rind, so this will decompose in there, and they are totally okay with that. Yeah, so melons as well. Just keep an eye on it. If anything, it's just the rate of things breaking down. So if you start to smell that something's rotting a little too fast and they can't keep up with it, I do recommend just removing it, maybe putting it in a more advanced worm bin. But yeah.
How often and how much should I feed my worms?
Yeah, so the worms actually eat half their body weight per day. So I actually got my first batch of worms online. I ordered them and they came to my doorstep. And so I think I ordered 3 pounds because I wanted a lot, and I had a much larger worm bin. And so I could literally feed them 1.5 pounds a day. I just honestly keep an eye on how much food they have. So I'll go through my worm bin once a week and just check on how much food they have. They actually don't like to be disturbed a whole lot. I find a lot more success in my worms if I'm not tossing them frequently. But I will say, as a beginner vermiculture person, I actually love to look at them all the time. So don't feel bad. They just dig further down. But yeah, so about maybe, depending on your size, 1 pound to 2 pounds a week.
Where should I store my worm bin?
Yeah, so honestly, if it's done properly, it doesn't smell. My roommate actually is not the biggest fan of worms. She just doesn't like seeing them. Creepy crawlers kind of gross her out. But because I maintain it, it doesn't smell. So I keep mine in my kitchen. You can keep it underneath your sink. So some things you want to keep away from is making sure it doesn't get too hot or cold. They do perfectly fine on the patio as long as the temperatures aren't too hot or cold. If they are out and in your sunny place, make sure they're under the shade because the bin will get really hot, and then I'll dry them out and get them just uncomfortable, and you can have some die-offs there, but anywhere inside or out.
Do you have to feed your worms and look at them and check in on them every day, or how does that work?
Yeah, I actually honestly check on mine probably once a week. So I kind of I'll go through my fridge on a weekly basis, or if I have scraps, like when I'm cooking, I just put it right on top of my bin. The food on top doesn't actually attract any gnat flies, we don't get any pests in our apartment. If it is an issue, maybe I'd recommend getting a Tupperware, like an old yogurt container or some other container to keep it sealed if you're worried about vermin. But then I'll actually just feed them once a week. They can go up to like 4 weeks just chilling on their own. If they don't have any food, they do end up eating the worm compost, so basically their pie product. It's not very healthy for them, but it's a survival technique to make sure they don't have any deaths. So you can actually go quite a bit without checking in on them or feeding them. But I recommend checking in at least once a week, every other week. But yeah, I've been out of town for about 2 or 3 weeks and they've still been perfectly fine.
And can you give them frozen food scraps?
Yeah, so one really, really good way, if it is really hot outside, they think of them as like little worm fruit popsicles. So it's actually recommended if it's hot and you have yours outside just to freeze some of the vegetables to put them in there to keep it cool. But freezing actually does help them break down the food. So when the food is in the freezer, it's already decomposing or it's breaking down the structure of the food. And then if you let that either thaw or put it straight in, it's a lot easier for them, a quicker way to actually start to eat the food.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm gonna be feeding my worms and they're gonna be decomposing and pooping, and that's good for the garden? What do I do with that?
Yeah, so multiple reasons why you'll want to like compost with worms. One thing, it's a lot faster than traditional composting. I also just like the idea of pets, but this is literally earth. This is soil. Like if in any natural condition, this is actually what's decomposing and creating our soil and earth. So what they're producing, worm castings, worm poop, is literally fresh fertilizer for any garden, any plants. And there's multiple things you can do. So one of two things, it's like, when do you know when to stop feeding / start to extract their worm compost, worm poop? So what you'll do is when the whole bin starts to turn really dark and black, you'll actually know that they've decomposed and almost eaten everything that's in the worm bin. So I would recommend kind of stopping feeding for a little while. And then what I would recommend is moving, physically think of splitting the bin in half. So you'll move everything that they're currently living in to one half of your worm bin. And then you'll make a new bed. So you'll get some paper and some coconut shreds. You'll put it in there. And then you just start feeding that side. I do put a little bit of the actual worm bin on the new side, so it has all the fresh bacteria that can help break down the new food. The worms will literally migrate where the food is. Some of them will linger. It takes about a few weeks. So keep feeding that one side of the new bin. Once you realize a lot of the worms have gone away from the old composting pile, then I just manually sift through and try to I don't like to waste any worms or have any of them perish. So I remove the ones I can see. I'll put them on the new side and I'll actually extract all the worm compost. From there, you can feed your garden, so you can put it straight on top of your plants or mix it into the soil. Or you can make an amazing fertilizer. It's called worm tea. So people have a misconception. They think so you'll have water output. So this right here is all the water that's just seeped from the worm bin, and that's why you always have the bottom. So people think that's worm tea, but this is just what's called lechin. So it's just the moisture that comes off of the worm bin. That's still really healthy for the soil, so you can actually put that right onto your garden. But what you'll do with the worm to make worm tea is you'll take all the worm castings, you'll put it in a nylon sock or like a cheese cloth, and you actually literally steep it in water. So what it's doing, it's taking all the fresh nutrients from the compost itself and putting it in a water, like a soluble form. And then you can spray that straight onto your garden to make a really, really great fertilizer to spread throughout your garden, and then still using what's left over to put physically into your soil.
What is the benefit of composting?
Yeah, so we've definitely talked about how it's like really good for your soil and your garden. But honestly, the reason why I started composting is because I didn't want to waste any food. So basically, if I was to throw my food away, since I don't have a garden to compost locally by, it would end up in the landfill and it would create greenhouse gases, methane, because of that anaerobic digestion. So not only is it a really good way for me to kind of see my little science experiment, but it makes a positive impact on how much waste I'm actually producing.
And that's it.
Yeah, so literally Courtney has her new bin and they are all ready to go, and my gift to you
recording. Thank you. Oh man. So worms kind of freak me out a little bit, to be totally honest. So I'm gonna do another video checking in on how I'm doing taking care of my worms. So be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on me taking care of my new babies. And that's it. Thank you, Krissy.
Thank you.
All right, and so the adventure begins. Worm babies are all buckled up. Here we go.